like to welcome you here today. Please don't regard the less than complete attendance as discourteous. Some of our colleagues are being forced by their whips to be in standing committees along the corridor and may perhaps come in a little later on, and one of our colleagues has got a domestic problem which we've just been notified of. But we are, of course, very pleased indeed to see you, and when we were having our visit in Greece, we saw your books on sale, I hope to your profit, in several of the museums that we visited. And it was obvious to us that, just as we felt it when you kindly attended our seminar, you're regarded as a major authority on these matters. And that being so, we particularly welcome you, and Mr. Fern will ask the first question.
Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Morning.
You argue that the deliberate looting of sites for commercial gain is, and I quote, the most serious threat to the world's heritage today. To what extent is the problem of looting greater than it was in the past?
I think the implication is absolutely right that it was a major problem in the past. It's been going on for a very long time. It started in ancient Egypt, I think, and certainly Etruscan tombs have been looted for a couple of centuries in exactly the way that one would deplore today. But it is at a much higher level than it was before. And whereas before, apart from gold seekers, which have always been through the ages, it was very much limited, I think, to the classical lands, Greece, Italy, Egypt, perhaps the Near East. Now it's really a worldwide problem. Peru has been extensively looted. Mali has been the focus of an enormous amount of looting in recent years. And then something I think is very offensive, in recent decades, the amount of looting in Cambodia, for instance, where temples are actually being dismantled and smuggled over borders. So I think the volume is worse, as it were. And of course, the world's heritage is a diminishing resource. It simply can't be replaced. So I hope that begins to answer your question.
And where would you say most of these artifacts go or trade through? I mean, is it London that's the worst place?
London is one of the centres. I think Switzerland is bad, if I may use that word, Geneva and other centres in Switzerland. Brussels has quite a bad reputation. New York is a major centre, but London is one of the major clearing houses. Then, of course, they end up in private collections, very often, I think, acquired by collectors who are not really entirely sensitive to the point that if they buy unprovenanced antiquities, they're really ultimately, indirectly funding the looting process. And I think not all collectors really understand that very well.
So have you any sympathy with the notion that the export laws of countries such as Greece and Italy are ineffective?
Well, I have every sympathy. Greece and indeed many countries have very stringent laws where all antiquities found belong to the state and so on, and they're not always very effectively applied. Of course, they have a major problem. When they have compensation provisions, they're not always very well applied. But a country like Mali, for instance, a very poor country, simply cannot cope. And it's very natural that when peasants find objects, they sell them on. And studies have been made which show that it's not the locals who make the money, usually. It's the middlemen right the way down the line who make the big profits.
And are those middlemen mostly here in this country or America?
In those countries I mentioned, there are many dealers in this country, there are many dealers in America, there are many in Switzerland. And of course it must be said that some of the things they deal in are antiquities that have been available for a long time with respectable provenance. I don't want to insist that every dealer is always handling illicit goods. But I would take the position now, I think, that unprovenanced antiquities, where it can't be shown where they've come from, where you can't trace the history back, I think it's fair to say that unprovenanced antiquities very often are looted. Of course, you can't always show that in every case. And that is certainly my view, and I think that's where the balance needs to shift. Hitherto, I think, museums have often said, oh, well, if we don't know it's looted, we might be free to buy it. But these days, I think one realizes, how would you know it was looted, sort of catch-22, clandestine excavation? And I think museums now are taking the position, the more respectable museums, I think most museums in this country, are taking the view that if it's unprovenanced, better not touch it.
So should there be tighter regulation here on the dealers and the auction houses?
I believe so. I believe, for instance, that it's strange that we have no import controls whatever, as far as I'm aware, on these matters, or in effect that is so. Certainly when Lord Inglewood said a few years ago, when he was the relevant spokesman in the House of Lords, he conceded it is not an offence in Britain to offer for sale publicly antiquities which have been illegally excavated and illegally exported from another country. And there has to be something wrong about that.
I would agree, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Following directly on that, Lord Renfrew, we had a discussion with the Metropolitan Police last week, and we hope that they're going to come and give us evidence. And they made the very point that you just made to Mr. Fern, namely that while it's illegal in this country to trade in goods that are stolen, it is not illegal to trade in goods which have been illegally exported. Would you advocate making that a criminal offence?
I would myself, yes. There may be many difficulties in applying these things in practice, but I think one of the weaknesses at the moment is that there is no official position that it's wrong. I well understand that there are problems in making legislation of that kind work, and I can well understand there may be arguments that if you can't make it work, is it good legislation? But I myself think it is really rather a scandal that there is no official position in this country that says this is wrong. For example, the UNESCO Convention, you may want to return to that later, but I think it's a scandal that the British government has not long ago subscribed to the UNESCO Convention. I don't think subscribing to it would change the world in practice, but it would at least take a position that the British government, like many other governments, deprecates the looting process. And that is not the official position. You may have the minister saying, oh, he agrees and so on in a statement or an interview, but there is no official government position that actually says, yes, we feel this is wrong and we feel it ought to be stopped. And I feel very strongly the first move is to have a moral position, if I can use that word, ethical position even on the matter, and then the practicalities may be more difficult to work out, but I think that's stage 2, sir.
Secondly, you talked about the need to establish provenance. One of our colleagues in particular, Mr. Wyatt, but the rest of us too, have been interested in the possibility of the equivalent of a motor car logbook. But again, when we discussed this with the Metropolitan Police, they said that it was impracticable because of the huge and unquantifiable numbers of articles traded. We did put to them, and it seemed that it found some favour with them, that one might at least gain some kind of control if, say, the largest auction houses, those with perhaps a specified annual turnover, had to be licensed. And then, if that was so, then they could be asked, that they could have an obligation as part of their license to establish provenance. Have you any views on that?
First of all, if I may say so, I think the principle is absolutely right. There may be difficulties in applying it, but I think the notion that if an antiquity is offered for sale, if it's a respectable antiquity, you should know who sold it to the dealer and who sold it to them, and back along the road where it came from. I think that is absolutely right. So I very much support and agree with the concept. As to how to apply it, I can see there are many difficulties, but I think if it were really incumbent, as you say, on an auction house. At the moment, you look through the pages of the catalogue, and a few are from old collections, the Duke of Sutherland's mummy case from 100 years ago. We tell how it came out of Egypt, but many of them just say, or don't say anything, unprovenanced. And I think that really isn't good enough, and I think there should be the onus upon them to do exactly as you say. And I think not only that, but one might also, just following the approach you're indicating, in addition, have some sort of price or value threshold. And I think you could apply the same principle to private dealers, or I suppose the auction houses are private also, but to dealers other than auction houses, and if they advertise for sale an object, an antiquity, I mean, not an other class of object, an antiquity for more than, I don't know, £2,000, £3,000, whatever the figure is, then there should be an obligation on them to explain how they've got it. And if they can't explain how they've got it, I don't see the merit in the secrecy. You discuss this when they say, oh, we couldn't do that, client confidentiality and so on. But as my colleague Neil Brodie has said, you don't worry about client confidentiality while you're buying a used car. You expect to know where it's from. And I honestly don't see the difference.
The third point, you were referring, indeed, you and your colleagues did so during the seminar we had, to the misfortunes of an impoverished third world country like Mali, which is not only losing wealth, but is losing part of its heritage. Would you say whether you feel there is an argument for dealing with such matters to be eligible for aid from the International Development Department in this country, or the European Union, or other agencies?
That's a very interesting idea which I hadn't thought of. And my first reaction is yes, except that I think one does have to recognize how difficult it is for these countries. If, for instance, it wasn't disadvantaging them, if there was going to be some aid earmarked for their museum service or their cultural department, I think in many of these countries there's a threshold to pass. Once it's worked very well in Peru, once the locals see that there's some benefit to keeping the stuff there, if there can be some local museums, then there begins to be some local tourism. And so it's not just you mustn't sell the stuff, but on the contrary, this is your heritage, and you can do something useful with it, such as attract tourism. I think if there were an aid component in that direction, so that it was as much a carrot as a stick, I think it would be a very enlightened approach.
One other question that just arises out of what you said to me about the importance of heritage and built heritage to tourism. You told us about how in Cambodia the temples at Angkor and elsewhere are actually being dismantled. Ought there to be some action either by the host government or in a country where they can't afford it, again, to assist those in safeguarding their heritage through clamping down on this trade and assisting them to have people who can do it if they can't afford to do it themselves?
I think it's very difficult to police, as it were, a country like Cambodia, and so I think what you said in the second part of your question is right. It's the trade one has to target. I don't think one can police every site in every country. Even a well-organized country can't do that because they crop up everywhere. You don't know where things are going to be found. Temples you may do, but underground things you don't. So I think, yes, it is the trade that one has to try and target and give encouragement to such countries to clamp down on the trade. I'm sure it's a difficult job because it is sometimes, particularly in the Orient, linked with gun running and drugs and so on. That may be exaggerated as a claim in some cases, but I think it's well documented in Cambodia and Thailand. And when you have states which are run by sort of military, sort of powerful generals and so on, I think it's very difficult to get a grip on it. But I would support that view. But my own view also is that it is incumbent upon us to put our own house in order. And the same would go for the Americans and the other big buyer countries, Europe as a bloc also, and Switzerland. Because if there were not the strong market, I think there wouldn't be the strong pull to get the stuff out of the source countries.
Mr. Maxton.
That of course is true, but some countries, particularly Greece and Italy and Turkey, have very, very strict rules, as Mr. Bairn alluded to. And don't those strict rules actually make the illicit trade more likely rather than less, in that somebody finds something, they know they've got to give it away, they know there's a market for it. Actually, they know also that there are 100 of these objects in the local museum already. So the local museum won't particularly want it. So wouldn't it be better if these countries actually did have more relaxed and regulated laws about antiquities which are found, and allow some of them, and maybe a fairly large proportion of them, to go onto the open market and to be sold with a provenance, which you would then know where it came from, exactly the site it came from, etc., rather than having this very strict thing which says everything goes to the state, and you may be compensated, you may not be, and that's the end of it.
Well, I've heard that argued very seriously by very well informed people, and I can see that if, say, a nation like Egypt felt it could sell some of its duplicates, and if they were very fully documented and so on, I can see it might work, as you suggest. But I do see what a nightmare it would be for such a country to organize such a process without corruption entering in. I think when any nation sells state property, one runs into severe difficulties. But I think in a way, the argument, if we're talking as relates to illicit excavations, slightly misses the point, because the real damage is not so much done by the antiquities leaving the country. The real damage is done by the looting process, where objects are excavated clandestinely from sites which are thereby destroyed, and all the information is lost. And that is how we find out about the human past. And once they're out of the ground, in a way the damage is done. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So any process that would somehow legitimize the digging up of sites to produce artifacts, including minor artifacts, because the diggers don't know when they start digging what they're going to find. And I've heard it said that, for instance, in Israel, when there's a bit of a shortage of small antiquities, they go out and dig some more. You know, haven't got enough Roman lamps this week in stock, let's go and dig some more up. And that certainly does a great deal of damage. So although the view you're putting forward has been very seriously advocated, it's not my own view. I think it would be better if we could make it less fashionable to collect antiquities. I get very annoyed when collectors, major collectors like Leon Levy, Shelby White, Georgia Ortiz, put their exhibitions on public show, are encouraged to do so by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, sort of fashionable cocktail parties and so on. There was a disreputable event of that kind in the Royal Academy here in Britain a few years ago. You know, when the smart set say, oh, let me see your Tang figurines or your Greek vases, I think this is really where a lot of the trouble comes from. And so I'd like to see it all damped down.
Yeah, I can understand that, and because you are an archaeologist. But at the end of the day, I mean, there are thousands. In fact, you can argue that almost every field and every area in the country has some archaeology, even if it's just of the last century or whatever it might be. How many archaeologists actually practice in the world?
Well, we don't want to dig it all up at once. Better to leave it for posterity. I think it's our mission to dig it all up. But no, your point is absolutely right, though. There is a lot of stuff, and I think there is a line well worth exploring. If it's been dug up legally, this would be the point, and this is where we might agree. If it's been illicitly dug up, I think it's bad, because if you permit that, then you're permitting the looting process. But if, on the other hand, material has been produced in controlled excavations, has been recorded, and then people say, well, we don't need this in our museum, let's sell it, we might even know where it's going to, where it could be consulted. I think along those lines, a system could be constructed, and that would fall into what you're saying to some extent.
Yeah, but you say, basically what you, however, are saying is that there are archaeological sites which should be left alone. We know they're there, should be left alone and never touched until sometime maybe in the future, 100 years from now, because that's if you take the time scale of the number of these archaeological sites, sometime in the future, an archaeological survey will be done and somebody will go in and actually dig it up. I mean,
I'm saying two things, and that's one of them. I'm first of all saying that it really is wrong to go and dig up an archaeological site in an uncontrolled way, clandestinely, to produce material without publication. That is simply destroying information about the past. Now, that's not what you're saying, I realize, Mr. Maxim, but that, for me, is the main point. But to address your second point, yes, it's only a few decades, for instance, since radiocarbon dating became available. Those sites which were completely excavated prior to the development of radiocarbon dating remain undated. Just recently we've got the development of molecular genetic studies, ancient DNA and so on. And so there is no doubt that we will in the future have the potential to learn more from certain sites than we do now. It's a matter for regret that so much of Stonehenge was excavated officially in the 1920s, and not a great deal was learned from it. So although you make it sound rather foolish to leave this as a resource for the future, because it's not a sustainable, it's not like elephant ivory. If the elephants survive in sufficient numbers, you can go on trading elephant ivory, so long as you get the balance right. But the archaeological resource is a diminishing resource and is not replaceable.
but has been destroyed over centuries. I mean, let's be clear about this. Every generation destroys, you know, a very major part of the archaeological remains of the previous generation.
That's absolutely right. But what I think is to be lamented is that we may feel we're learning more, but the situation is getting worse, not better. Not only because there's less left, but because the volume of destruction has increased in recent decades. And that is, I think, a matter of concern for us all.
Yeah, can I just, however, I mean, although I take your point very much about looting, I think, isn't it a slight exaggeration to say it is the most serious threat to the world's heritage today? Isn't development the major threat? In other words, constant building new hotels, new whatever it might be, on sites. Isn't that a much greater threat?
I think that's very arguable. I'm not sure that the two have been quantified, but the great thing is that in many countries there is now mitigation of such development. In this country, I think we have a good system whereby if something is going to motorway go through or a building built, there is rescue archaeology following a survey, so that every effort is made to extract as much information as possible. And I think that's quite a successful enterprise. It may be, I think it's difficult to quantify these things, but what of course is so offensive, maybe a moral point, what is so offensive about the looting, it's deliberately done, and the irony is it's done to provide antiquities for people like these rich collectors I mentioned, who actually do have a sensitive feeling for them, but don't somehow realize that they're destroying our information about the past by buying them.
Lastly, on coming back to that point about the draconian, linking the last and the first question, if you like, on the draconian laws, isn't that one of the impacts of the very strict draconian laws, which says everything goes to the state, is that where a developer does maybe, the crane goes in and it pulls up some antiquities, isn't there a grave danger, and they know that that could hold up the development for 6 months or a year, and they are obviously cash strapped, they want to get it done. Isn't there a very great danger in those sort of situations that they just immediately put the bulldozers in and get it done and don't make sure that nobody give the crane driver a small bribe to stop them taking it any further?
I think that's true, but I think these temptations apply anywhere, not just when they're draconian laws. Any developer knows that it's going to cost money if he's held up a month or two. This has been a great worry in rescue archaeology in this country, but I think the rescue archaeologists have got sufficiently well organized that they can actually guarantee, give us 4 weeks on the site, and we'll leave the site after 4 weeks. But that is a universal problem, and it's absolutely right what you're saying.
Following on from your exchanges with Mr. Maxim, can I ask you a very large question, which you may regard as a question not capable of answer? On the one hand, we have damage to sites, and that can be done either by what the Italians, when we were there, called scavatori clandestini, who pillage a site for what they can get out of it. Or you can have it done by grandiose governments, Saddam Hussein damaging Nineveh in order to turn it into a monument to himself, and what Mussolini apparently did with Roman remains in Libya. So clearly the preservation of those for knowledge is, to you, understandably important. On the other hand, the actual trade in objects, whether they're objects taken from sites or objects stolen, is not only damaging in itself, but so we were told by the Metropolitan Police, is not only second only in the world to the drug trade, but also is used for the drug trade as a laundering activity for drug money. So if I were to ask you which you regard as the more damaging and the one requiring the more urgent action, would it be preservation of sites in order to obtain information from them, or a stringent action as is possible to prevent illegal trading?
Well, of course, both are desirable. It doesn't have to be an either-or, I suppose. But I think the most serious enterprise is the deliberate destruction of sites, and that is to provide the goods for the trading. So I do feel that the solution is to clamp down on the illicit trade, the trade in illicit antiquities. And to go back to your point about Saddam Hussein or whatever, I think the truth is, it's sad to say, that private enterprise is much more powerful, so that you find in Peru, for instance, numerous sites. Almost every time a cemetery becomes known, it is looted. This is true in many South American countries. No government can wreak destruction as effectively as the totality of the populace, or in Jordan, where complete cemeteries have been looted, complete areas devastated. And this is to supply goods for the illicit trade. So I do see that as the main problem. And I don't see it as in any way conflicting what you yourself were saying earlier. Could we not support some countries to have a better antiquities service, do a better job of maintaining their own sites and so on? I don't think the two are necessarily in conflict.
Mr. King.
Yes, this is early stage of our inquiry, and I'd like to ask a basic question. You touched on it when Mr. Maxon was asking questions. That is, I can understand poor people in Mali looting for, because they need the money desperately. I can understand dealers dealing for money, as well as having obviously a deep interest in the subject. I can understand the reason for having the antiquities to learn about our past. But the area that I've little understanding, I think my culture is more football and beer, the people the private collectors who want these things to keep them for themselves. You mentioned they do put them on display now and again. Can you paint a picture of that sort of world to help us understand?
Sure I can. When I was a schoolboy, I was a collector of coins. For instance, I have a coin collection. I haven't collected coins of late, but I think many people find a fascination in collecting things, in coming into touch with things. There is a certain, I think, very valid romance. You have a piece of Roman pottery in your hand, and this has just emerged from the earth, and it's been there for 2,000 years, and who used it and so on. So there is an immediacy. But then I think the collecting passion has been there for a long time, and it must be said that in the early development of archaeology, it was very positive. That was how attention was first directed to the past in say, Renaissance Rome. These wonderful sculptures being dug up. The Pope and his cardinals and princes were in competition who's going to buy this wonderful sculpture. So it becomes very competitive, and they do become status symbols. So to go back to one aspect of your question, I named one or two collectors. There are many more. Perhaps I shouldn't be naming individuals, but people of great wealth who establish a collection. And it's very much an American syndrome, but you see it now in Japan also with the foundation of the Miho Museum, which I don't know much about, but seems to be rather disastrous. It's just that it's very high status to own your Van Gogh sunflowers if you can afford them. So it's very high status to have a nice collection of classical marbles or Greek vases or whatever. And it really always has been so. And I think one of the services that one has to bring about is to suggest it isn't a good idea, it isn't smart, it isn't a good thing to have looted antiquities on your mantelpiece. And that, as I say, is why I think one of the total failures in this country over the past, well, since the UNESCO Convention of 1970, has been for the government not to enunciate this principle, which I think most of us would agree with, that looting of antiquities is bad. And so it is ironic that, as I mentioned just a few years ago, there was the Royal Academy putting on an exhibition of a private collection. Most of the pieces there were unprovenanced. Many of them were clearly looted. Some were demonstrably looted. And the owner of the collection wrote a catalogue saying the art of the absolute, and everybody came and admired. I wrote an article in The Guardian criticising this, and some art critics wrote back and said, oh, no, these are the common heritage of humankind, these antiquities. Some mere archaeologists shouldn't criticise that they don't have a decent provenance. Now, of course, they are beautiful, and they do attract people, but we know about them and we value them because we know something about them. And we know something about them because we've learnt about that from proper excavations and proper publications. A rather rambling answer, but I hope it addresses itself partly to what you said.
Trying to build a picture for people like me, maybe come from a different culture than yourself.
To a few cocktail parties, if I may say so, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
If there's draft beer, even if there isn't.
It'll have to be.
I can drink white wine as good as anybody.
It'll have to be a pink gin or something at the Metropolitan Museum.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that despite the culture I come from, there's nobody in the world, even you, don't care more than I do about preserving these things and using them for education. Now, what would you like us to recommend in our report in order to improve the situation?
Thank you. Well, I'd like you to recommend, first of all, that the government take a really strong position. In order to take a strong position, I think it would have to, unless there are good reasons not to, it would have to subscribe to the UNESCO and UNIDROIT conventions. I've never heard a single good reason why the government can't subscribe to the UNESCO convention. Not one suggested, oh, there'll be an obligation to make a list. But if you consult the UNESCO officials, you'll find that the categories the government already uses constitute a list. And I don't really think there are very good reasons against the UNIDROIT convention. So as an aside, if I may say so, I think you might do very well to try and find out from the government if it really does have detailed objections and what those are. And then, having established that position, brought us into an international framework which would also protect our own antiquities when they turn up in New York. The moment we can't get them back, there's no international framework. Then I think perhaps something very much along the lines of what the chairman was saying, trying to ask how we do clamp down in practice, and the notion of having transparency in these areas. And then I think also there is more to be done in the way the licensing system works. But I won't go into detail on that because I know I've seen Dr. Brodie's submission, and I think he's addressed himself in some detail to that. But it could well be that if one had a threshold, and that any antiquity leaving this country in order to get an export license, if it was more valuable than, say, £1,000, £1,500, £2,000, not trivial figures, if it needed a license, and if in order to get a license there had to be some information about where it came from, so we weren't being used as a clearinghouse, this country, for laundering illicit antiquities, I think that would be quite practical, and I think those would be very constructive moves.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, following on that, you say in your submission to us that Britain is making absolutely no contribution to the worldwide protection of the archaeological and historic heritage. Is that a bit strong? Are we doing absolutely nothing?
Well, we're protecting our own heritage in Britain. Our own Treasure Act in Britain is good, and I'd like to mention the voluntary scheme for the reporting of portable antiquities found in this country, which has been very much supported by the present government and by Mr. Howth. I think that is excellent. That is a way where information is being gathered. So I think, and also the rescue archaeology provisions in this country, I think in many ways are quite good. So to the extent that we are making not a bad job, I think, of looking after our own British heritage. With that exception, yes. I think it's a scandal that it's completely free. It's a thieves' kitchen, or it could be so described, the freedom with which illicit antiquities may enter this country, and it's not even officially disapproved of in any way. So I would stand by that statement, except for the British case, where I think there is a decent effort being made.
We look after our own.
Yes, well, that's a good place to start. Charity or whatever begins at home, but hasn't got much further yet, I think.
Right, thank you.
Mrs. Organ.
Thank you. I mean, if London is, as you described, the centre of the thieves' kitchen, and it is a clearing house for much of the illicit trade, I mean, you've made it quite clear that there's a need to clamp down. Can we just investigate what we could do about the material actually physically coming into the country? We heard when we were away in Rome that in the United States, for instance, they have now had a recent policy of checking physically stuff as it's coming through the ports. Now, we have a problem here, don't we? Because we're in the European Union and goods may move freely between one European country and another. Consequently, our customs officers are not unpacking crates if it's come from Italy or Greece or Brussels. But Switzerland, you mentioned earlier, is the centre. It seems to sort of go Greece, Italy, into Switzerland and then to London, are not in the EU. Are you then advocating that we should be unpacking any sort of shipment that is coming from Switzerland on the basis that there's a high percentage of illicit antiquities coming that route?
Not physically, no, but in a legal sense, very possibly. First, I wouldn't want to say that London is the leading, it is one of the leading clearinghouses. I don't want to exaggerate the position. I think there are, as I said earlier, a number of centres in the world, and London is prominent among them, let's put it that way. Secondly, I understand that Switzerland is actually considering itself joining UNESCO and joining UNIDROIT, whereas we are not. So we don't want to paint Switzerland much blacker than Britain because Switzerland has not yet formally rejected that. But yes, what I do feel is, and indeed you referred to the European regulations, there is an obligation on us, which I don't think we discharge very well, in checking when material from the European Union comes through, European community comes through Britain and is exported, we're supposed to check that it has left the country of origin within Europe appropriately. Precisely, there is an agreement between the European community countries to clamp down on the illicit export of cultural property originating in Europe. Now, I don't think we do that very effectively. But to the, you paint a picture, you know, sort of burly men opening crates and so on. But let us remember that in order for the trade to work, the trade in illicit antiquities to work, at some point it's got to become open. It's got to be sold through the sale room, it's got to be sold through the gallery, and it's got to end up in the smart collection, and the smart collector has to feel that he or she has bought it legally. So that if you set up a framework whereby, yes, it is against the law to do these things, and if you have some monitoring system, as was being discussed for the auction houses and the galleries, that to some extent fits the bill. I do think, though, I mean, there are cases where customs do discover things, and as you will have heard if you've been speaking to the police or to customs, sometimes they know that it's been, well, they infer, probably rightly, that it's been illicitly excavated, but they can't demonstrate that it's been stolen from a particular person. That's the whole catch-22 of the business, so they often can't do much about it. To give you one example, the Sevso treasure, which is one of my favourite examples, which was purchased by a private collector in this country, this wonderful hoard of Roman silver, and it's not known whether it came from Hungary or Croatia or the Lebanon. When it got to New York, it was being sold publicly, it was going to be auctioned by Sotheby's in Switzerland. When it got to New York, there was a court case because those countries that were claiming it, unfortunately there are a lot of them claiming it, those countries claiming it said it's ours, and in the New York court, something could be done. It couldn't be, they couldn't bring this action in London because we have no legal framework. And so I think, yes, Britain is worse at the moment than most of these other countries, but I don't think one needs to have a sort of circus of opening crates at the borders. I think if there's a proper legal framework, it would begin to have its own effect, because the good thing is that most of the collectors want to buy stuff legally. If they can't get good title, they don't want it. And I think if we can prevent them getting good title by appropriate legal instruments, we can do the job.
Thank you.
And I suppose that good title means that there's a greater chance for the purchasers that what they're buying is actually genuine.
Well, that's right. A field that I'm interested in is the early Cycladic figurines you may have seen when you were in Greece. And there's actually no way of authenticating those. They're made of marble. It's not a material that you can do more than say, yes, it came from that quarry. And so it's thought there's a huge number of complete fakes there. But if you can, if you have the opportunity with any antiquity, if it has a good provenance that takes it back to where it came from the ground, and that might relate to what Mr. Maxton is saying in such a case where there was a certificate, yes, this is sold by the Egyptian government and we know where it came from. You're right, then you also have a fair hope that it's genuine.
Lord Renfrew, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for coming here this morning. I'll call on Mr. Fern to ask the first question.
Good morning. Could you tell us first how great is the scale of looting in this country, in the United Kingdom?
That's a question we would dearly like to have answered, I think, sir.
You must have thoughts.
Because of its nature, it's clandestine, it's extremely difficult to be certain. One can turn to well-known instances, and several of them have been mentioned in your papers, places like Wanborough, which has clearly been not only looted but repeatedly looted, and even in the same area, and only in the last month or two, another coin hoard site repeatedly visited at night by people looking for more coins. But it's, in a sense, a series of individual instances, in this case documented. The ones we don't know about, we can't quantify. I think we're beginning to feel that it's a fairly large problem simply by looking at what is turning up not only in antiquities shops and sale rooms, but also at looking at what is turning up in places abroad. My colleague at the York Archaeological Trust gave a lecture in a conference on Viking archaeology in Los Angeles last month and was shown a complete table full of Viking antiquities, none of which, to his knowledge, had been recorded in the literature, but had all been bought by a local collector, and many of them clearly must have come either from the British Isles or from adjacent parts of Scandinavia. So perhaps another example is a rally in Colorado, which is being offered to metal detectorists now. You can go on September the 9th, and there are 10,000 objects of British origin which have been salted in the land around Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, and you can go and detect for them on this particular day. We're beginning to see accumulating evidence of this kind which suggests that there is a huge trade in antiquities which are either illicitly obtained or have been exported from Britain without a license. But I think possibly your committee might recommend an inquiry to see if this can be quantified in some way.
What about maritime sites?
This is, again, a problem of knowledge. We believe that there is a lot of diving going on, and we know there is a lot of diving going on, often on wrecks, and there is anecdotal evidence that objects are often moved from wrecks. I believe there is an intention this year or next year to declare an amnesty in the hopes that divers who have much of this material will actually declare it. and I believe the receiver of Rex is currently considering such an amnesty and is discussing it with the chiefs of police. That might give us some indication of the extent of loss on maritime sites. But there, of course, the problem is even worse. You don't see these people. They're underwater when they're doing the damage. On land, at least there's a chance you might see them approaching the site. So there's a great problem in quantifying this, and I think when we actually find the answers, we'll find it's more than anybody had estimated.
And the legal systems that are in existence, if they are, to prevent looting, Scotland have better ones than ours. And why? I mean, why is theirs better than ours?
Well, I think it's because the medieval laws have evolved in slightly different ways. But in Scotland, objects which have no objects found in the ground which have no owner are deemed to belong to the Crown. It's a concept of bona vacantia, and I'm sure Professor Palmer can explain it to us in a little more detail. But in practice, the result is that every archaeological object found in Scotland has a chance of entering the national or regional collections. It has to be reported to the remembrancer, who refers it to a treasure trove reviewing committee, and objects, whether they be gold, silver, coins, or of any other materials, come within this, any kind of object. And so it covers the whole range of objects. In England and Wales, we think of treasure trove as gold, silver, and coins of the realm, and one or two other associated things. But in Scotland, everything comes under that rule. It's a great system, and a lot comes in that way. But even in Scotland, they don't know how much is not being reported. And I believe they were considering, the Treasure Trove Reviewing Committee was considering trying to find out or trying to estimate how much was being lost unbeknown to them. It's a good system if it works, and it does seem in general to work.
Could I hear what the Professor has to say on that one?
Yes.
Scottish law.
Well, I'm not a Scottish lawyer, and I think it's fair to point out that the English law has to an extent drawn abreast of Scottish law in recent years with the enactment of the Treasure Act 1996, which I think goes a long way towards safeguarding those valuable finds in the ground which might hitherto have been lost. Although it encompasses or includes the old concept of treasure trove, which was very narrow, it has further extended the notion of treasure, that is, objects which are now in Crown ownership. And I think it is a good piece of legislation, and I think it was based on what was politically viable and acceptable at the time. Nor is it, I may say, the only thing which the United Kingdom has done in recent years. It has also, as I'm sure you know, abolished the doctrine of market overt from the 3rd of January 1995, so that one can no longer get a good title simply by buying in good faith in an open public market. And of course there is the export licensing system as well, which, if it were properly acknowledged by looters, would itself provide a very valuable constraint on the passage of objects abroad. But to return to your earlier question, what is the volume and quantity of this sort of pillage? The answer is we simply do not know, because A, there has been no inquiry, and B, there is inadequate legislation. If we're talking about art, stolen art, we have the insurers' figures and we have the police crime figures. If we're talking about things in the ground, the very presence of which we do not know until they go, it is impossible to find out. And the only way in which we can even get a picture of this is either to scout the auction houses abroad and find out what sorts of things must come from here, or listen to anecdotal evidence, or in some cases look at the litigation. And if we look at the litigation, we find that far more claims by overseas victims of the wrongful removal of cultural objects succeed in this country than do claims by people in this country or institutions in this country suing abroad. I cannot remember the last time that a United Kingdom entity or individual successfully recovered a looted cultural object abroad in a foreign court. I can remember very clearly the case brought by the rector of Stolangtoft in 1987, 10 years after the panels were looted from his church in the Dutch courts, which he lost. He lost because the court applied Dutch law, and Dutch law said the buyer got a good title. William Winkworth, whom we mentioned in an earlier meeting, sued in this country for the recovery of his works of art, which had gone abroad to Italy and back again, and he lost too. Whereas at least 3 times in the last decade, we have awarded cultural property to overseas claimants, quite rightly, I may say. So there is an imbalance here, I think.
I mean, our laws are not as good as those abroad.
I think part of the trouble is that we are not linked into an international enforcement system. If we are concerned about the problem of outflow, our own domestic legislation can never solve this problem, because we can never legislate for what a Dutch or a Swedish or a Swiss court will do. The time must come sooner or later when we must recognize that if we are to adequately protect our own past, we need to enter into a field of activity, a consortium or a participative agreement by which overseas countries become obliged to honour our cultural property, as at the moment we largely do theirs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Maxwell.
The difference between England and Scotland law is not just that, of course. And the other aspects of Scottish law I'm not so sure are so good at protecting. Because, of course, as far as I understand it, in England, a piece of stolen property remains a piece of stolen property basically forever, and is therefore reclaimable by the original owner if it is ever discovered. In Scotland, again, I'm not a Scottish lawyer either, but as far as I understand the law in Scotland, once a legitimate purchaser has bought it in good faith, it then ceases to be a piece of stolen property, and it is not therefore reclaimable. Doesn't that actually, that difference, mean that there could be some transfer between countries where if you can sell it in Scotland, a piece of stolen property or looted property, you actually have got more chance of it then not being traceable?
Well, I'm open to correction on this point, and I would bow to superior knowledge, but my understanding is
I hasten
whatever its source, but my understanding is that there isn't so great a difference between English and Scottish law on these points. That the basic principle of English law, which was recognized in the Winkworth case about the stolen Japanese works of art, which incidentally cited a Scottish case as authority for it, is nemo dat quod non habet. If you don't own something, you can't give good title, and so if you've merely stolen it and not bought it in good faith or whatever, then you cannot pass on a title even to a good faith purchaser. But of course, one exception to that is that the owner can only get the thing back if he or she sues within the limitation period. And under the United Kingdom limitation law, Limitation Act 1980, the limitation period ceases 6 years after a good faith purchase. And that's what was alleged in the famous Madame de Préval case in 1997. Though it failed, the defence failed there. Those are the problems. So sometimes we, I think, exaggerate the difference between ourselves and continental systems. You can get a good title by a good faith purchase under English law because the limitation period will expire 6 years after that.
Right. Can I switch to the actual archaeological site?
Can I just
Sorry,
ask a question
sure.
about that, just to clarify the situation for myself. Listening to your exchanges with Mr. Maxton, he's Scottish, you're a lawyer. Neither of you are Scottish lawyers, and I'm neither Scottish nor a lawyer. But was I to take it that the successful action that took place in the United States some time ago, whereby the Cypriot government recovered a stolen antiquity, would not have been possible in Scotland? Or is it because it's a civil action it would still have been possible?
That raises very difficult questions, and I cannot say with confidence at all that the result would have been different. What the court in Indiana decided was that the law governing this transaction, which had occurred, if you remember, in the Freeport zone of Geneva Airport, was not Swiss law, which would normally be the position, but Indiana law as the law having the closest connection with the transaction. So Swiss law did not apply. The court went on to say that even if Swiss law had applied, it would require a purchase in good faith, which this was not. Some would say patently was not. I am not at all sure that a Scottish court would approach the matter in any different way. I think it might well have applied Swiss law to the transaction rather than Scottish law, because I think what's called the lex situs principle is possibly stronger in this country. That is the principle that the effect of the transaction is governed by the law of the country where the thing is at the time, i.e. Switzerland. But having done that, I think the Scottish court would almost inevitably have held, as the Indiana court did, that would only protect the buyer if there were a purchase in good faith, which here there was not.
Yeah. I mean, there are hundreds of scheduled ancient monuments and archaeological sites around the country, and those are the scheduled ones. can we effectively protect them?
Well, there are thousands, about 20,000 I think now, and there may well be more in due course. That, of course, does, many of them are large, many of them in the countryside, many of them are not surveyed from one day to another, and they are vulnerable. I think what has been a strength is that people are aware that those sites come under the law, and particularly metal detectorists who adhere to the various codes that the metal detecting organisations have laid down avoid them. There may be detectorists and others who don't care about codes and who attack them illicitly. And once again, we don't know how often this takes place. We do know it does take place, and there are documented occurrences, Corbridge and elsewhere, repeated attacks on scheduled sites. The scheduling itself simply identifies the site and sets it within the law. It's not a very effective way of actually protecting those sites.
Could I?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
if I could add. I mean, what is interesting at the moment is the way that the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has asked English Heritage to carry out a review of what they mean by the historic environment. And certainly a conclusion that I have reached as an ex-inspector of ancient monuments before I saw the light, or rather post Sir Jocelyn, was that the Ancient Monuments Act is an ineffective piece of Victorian legislation. What I think is important is the change in cultural attitude. When I was young, in the 50s, I collected birds' eggs and I collected uncaught butterflies. This is something which would be totally unacceptable now, quite rightly. And I think one of the things that is interesting to see happening is that through the influence of programs like the Time Team, with its very large audience, that the people are getting a better appreciation of what their own past actually involves, and that one looks to that sort of broader cultural change being worked at, rather than necessarily always going for the sort of punitive legislation you were talking about earlier on.
Yeah. Is there, however, with archaeological sites in particular, particularly those that are tucked away, they're small, they're not awfully important, is there a dichotomy between telling people about them, that they're there, having a sign on the road that may say, you go up that hill there, you will come to a site, and there'll be a plaque which tells you that this is an archaeological site and gives you some indication of what it's about. A dichotomy between that and the fact that you then are telling everybody that that's an archaeological site, and that, you know, they look around, they can't see anybody for miles, and the danger is that they then start scraping around and seeing if they can find something. Is there a dichotomy there, and what should we do about it?
Certainly a problem. The 20,000 scheduled archaeological sites are simply a small proportion of the number that exist, and in our sites and monuments records around the country there are records of far more. And so there is on public record the location of a huge number of areas where archaeology is important. And I think many archaeologists these days almost think of it in the countryside as a continuum. There is archaeological evidence over much of the landscape. We have addressed this issue, and what do? Do you keep knowledge of these places secret? And if so, therefore, what use is it? Or do you make it public, in which case it's in danger? It's a real issue. I have seen in the last few days reference to a website which is offering those who wish to know about it the location not just of 20,000 archaeological sites in Britain, but 100,000. And one wonders why people need this knowledge. I think they're needing it because they're interested in metal detecting on those sites.
Well, the one
it's a very worrying and problem. I don't know the answer. You can't win either way.
What I'm thinking about, actually, is a very pleasant walk, and it gives a purpose to the walk, if you like, rather than just walking up into the hills and walking back down again. You walk up to this particular site, you then read the plaque, and you look at it, you think that's interesting, you look at the circle, and say, because it's a Pictish, I think, remain or something, and it's quite old, but I don't think there are probably any valuable remains there, but the site itself would be valuable in terms of what it would give in terms of knowledge. But it gives a point to a walk, and if that information wasn't there, to be honest, nobody would ever go up that hill if it wasn't there.
So how do we solve it?
I don't know.
The purpose of archaeology is to benefit the nation by telling it about its past.
Yeah.
And to add to enjoyment, to add to education, to add to tourism effort, all those good things. For that, you've got to have the knowledge freely available. What we are, I think, suggesting in the comments that Mr. Morgan Evans made is that we need to work on changing the climate of opinion, that it's simply unacceptable to go digging into these things. I think we probably find in Denmark, for example, much more of the population is aware that you simply don't dig into ancient monuments, and that essentially the business of having private collections of antiquities is something which could be questionable.
What is an archaeological site at the end of the day?
It's a site where there's material evidence of human activity in the past.
Right. From my bedroom window at home, I used to be able to look at Ravenscraig steelworks. It's now gone completely. Isn't that an archaeological site?
Absolutely.
And what are we doing to preserve it?
I was going to say archaeology begins yesterday, really.
Well, that's right. So, but we can't preserve all these sites, can we? Or can we? Should we? I mean, every steelwork that's been pulled down in the past is an archaeological site. Shouldn't we therefore say we preserve part of one of them?
And Renfrew has already answered that, I think, by saying that we do have a very fine system in Britain for dealing with sites that are threatened, with parts of the heritages to be swept away by recording, by selective examination, sometimes by preservation if they're important, and we think that they're going to be a benefit in the future. And we have a very reasonable way of solving that particular dilemma.
We don't try and preserve all coal mines, but in South Wales there is Big Pit Blaenavon, which is there preserved to give people some idea, and it can only be some idea, of what it was like to go down underground.
But that's exactly my point, in a sense. We preserve one.
Yes, I mustn't let my Welsh colleagues get away with this. There's one in Yorkshire as well, sir.
Well, they were late.
We preserve one. We don't preserve all.
No.
Whereas there's a great danger with earlier remains than that, that we attempt to preserve all of them at whatever cost.
English heritage, to be fair to them, does have policies on this. For example, if you take one of the earliest types of monuments, Neolithic long barrows, of which I think there are about 400 left in this country, there, which is rare and special and early, they attempt to preserve all of those. When you get to more common sites, of which you have thousands, then you don't. You take a selection for various reasons, and you try and introduce, as they try and do with their programme, a selective policy of preserving the best representative and other things that come within the criteria. If you try and preserve all the past, you deny change.
And you deny the future, yeah.
And you deny humanity.
Yes. Otherwise, the entire surface of the world will be preserved derelict sites. Mrs. Organ.
I'm interested in the reference you made to the Time Watch team and their programmes, and it's a bit like telling the public now that you can be an instant archaeologist in the same way that you can become an instant gardener and an instant home decorator, and and it's been a very popular programme. But what I'm concerned and want to move on in the second part of my question is that the public is being encouraged to look at their landscape and dig it up and take away the bits there, because nowhere in the programme, and I've watched several of them, when they find something, do they say, and now, with this piece of pottery, or this tile, or this medieval, except when it's human remains, what they will do with it. Whether they're going to put it back and cover it back, or whether they're going to offer it up to the Crown, or part of the Treasure Act. So the public are left feeling that I can dig up my back garden, I'll find something of value, it'll be very nice, very interesting, tells me a bit about who lived here a couple of hundred years ago, and I can keep those bits. I mean, that's one thing. What can we do to, inform the public that actually you can't just dig up a piece of ground and hold what's there for you? And the second part is about, you talked about metal detectors, which, when they go on holiday and up and down beaches and up and down ploughed fields, and there are some in an association and no doubt behave very responsibly, But there are thousands that, you know, go away for a weekend and they don't know. They don't know about the Treasure Act and they don't know about the Portable Antiquities Scheme. What can you do, what can we do to inform the public and make them aware that you can't just dig up and take away?
Well, you can make sure archaeology is in the national curriculum, which is a good start.
It's a bit stuffed already, the national curriculum, isn't it?
Well, yeah, well, yes, and it varies, but at least you accept that it is a legitimate part of a child's education.
Yeah.
I mean, and I say again, I'm no huge defender of time team, but you know, their young persons club, the young archaeologists club that are there, are really doing quite well, and that sort of activity is building. I would have thought with something like Time Team, one would have hoped that, I suppose, some of the dramatic thing is the excavation. But to be honest, in the end, scratch any archaeologist, and you would probably find that it is the item of discovery, the thrill of discovery is still the thing that they really enjoyed. But within Time Team, they talk about the geophysical side, the air photographs, the use of landform. I mean, you know, the excavations are put in a context. They look at buildings, they do the dendrochronology. They are trying to show the range of scientific techniques are being brought to bear. I mean, and their outreach audience, I mean, it's something I've only become aware of recently. Their outreach audience is 20 million, 1 in 3 of the British population.
But they never tell you what you're meant to do when you find the find. They
do, well, I suppose, yes, we should then ask Mick Aston and others to be more explicit about that. But, I mean, they are bringing in museum curators and others to talk and assess that. But
the team is very sensitive to this sort of comment, and I'm sure they'll pick up what you just said today.
I will ring Mick Aston at lunchtime and let him know.
And just could we have a little rider at the bottom, a health warning about it?
Could I add a little bit on the metal detecting front? The government's Portable Antiquities Scheme, which involves recording of antiquities found by metal detectorists, is having a tremendous effect in correcting that part of your question, the problem that you referred to there. We now have finds liaison officers in a number of counties who make it their business to go to metal detectorist clubs and places where they meet, offer this facility of identification and recording of artifacts. And the annual report, the second annual report, which Alan Howarth published, I think, only a week or two ago, demonstrates the tremendous success of the scheme in recovering information, but also it demonstrates the way in which this particular approach is penetrating metal detectors. 900 separate metal detectors contributed to that report, which means that the message is certainly getting through, and this process of creating a climate of opinion in which people know what's right to do is being achieved. Archaeologists don't want to have the objects in this case, they just want to have the information. And very often, well, it's the same really with the archaeological sites that are being ravaged here and abroad. Archaeologists want the information from it, they don't want the things, they want the data, so that it can become part of human knowledge.
And do you think that if we put it into the national curriculum, we have a sort of health warning on the Time Team programme, we keep in touch with metal detector associations and we extend the Portable Antiquities Scheme, is it going to have any effect on driving down the illicit trade in the UK?
I think there will always be the exceptions. I mean, after all, a major problem is almost the professional looter of sites. And like anything else, it's going to be very, very hard to crack down on the person who is really going to do things. But I would have thought that all these things could change. I mean, I would cite the bird's egg and butterfly collections. I mean, it's people still collect birds' eggs. A very few of them, but it is generally unacceptable, and one's not just because it's bad, because people have come to appreciate and value the thing more. In other words, you know, I take the thing with Time Team. I would like them not to put a health warning. I'd like them to actually go through into the museums and carry on, and people can then see the rest of the process. And to be fair, with some of the things, I mean, I mean, not to give Time Team all exposure, but Meet the Ancestors, Julian Richards. Now, you know, the opening of the Spitalfields lead coffin, the way that that went through into the museum and the fact that you can actually see it takes you through. So it's not only the thrill of the unexpected discovery, but it's what you get out of it, and then seeing it in context. And it is, in that case, one of those objects that can be widely available to the public.
Thank you.
Mrs. Golding.
Yes, Lord Renfrew was very hard on the inaction of the British government, but I haven't heard anything about the action of archaeologists in getting together with perhaps legal departments of other countries and putting forward a scheme that could be linked internationally to try and stop this trade. Has it been done?
Lord Renfrew, I think, perhaps should have mentioned an initiative of his own institute in Cambridge, which was to convene a conference last year, bringing together the chief archaeologists concerned with the looting issue in, I think there may have been 40 countries there. The outcome of the conference was steps to set up an international conference of the kind that we represent here between us, in a British version, I think, trying to take our model and use it to bring minds together from all around the globe to see whether some kind of concerted action can be taken that will improve the matter on an international scale. So yes, there are moves there, and I'm sure you'll know moves in international fora on the legislative front. UNESCO, for example, has been promoting these series of conventions for long enough.
Are there reports on these conferences that might be useful to look at?
Well, there is certainly, yes, material to which one can have access. I mean, the first thing I would mention are the International Museum codes, for example. This is
I'm sorry, I can't.
Yes,
Could you speak a little louder?
Sorry, my voice is rather slow. The international and indeed national museum codes that not only archaeologists but museologists have got together and have devised principles which define those objects which they will not acquire and the circumstances in which they will only acquire particular other objects. And this has been, I think, a step ahead. And for example, compliance with the Museums Association Code of Practice is a requirement of registration, which is in turn a requirement of funding. So these have been effective. There are other international schemes, such as the Mauritius scheme for Commonwealth countries, and there has been quite a lot of activity. UNESCO is always promoting the international restitution of objects, but it's worth emphasizing here that restitution in the archaeological field is a very poor second to prevention. And that is, I think, where there is a limit to what archaeologists and all people other than governments can do. Something which hasn't really been mentioned much so far is the need, if there is to be an effective control over the honourable trade as well as the dishonourable, of point of entry control. This is the factor which I think is neglected, which is specified in Article 7A of the UNESCO Convention. In other words, it's not enough simply to say, if something comes here, we will give it back to you. What you need to do is to suffocate the illicit trade by making sure that there is nowhere where it can go. And you do this by enacting provisions which say this country will not allow in something which has been illegally excavated. And that, in effect, is what the United States has done, and that, of course, was shown recently in the Steinhardt case involving the Sicilian gold platter, which was seized at customs and forfeited because it had been taken illegally out of Italy. The customs declaration stated its origin of Switzerland. It was not true, and so there was an offence under the customs legislation there. It was also held to have been stolen from Italy, and that is a further offence to knowingly import stolen objects. So that is another way of doing it. Rather than saying to other countries in the world, you give us our stuff back and we will give you back yours, is to say it just shan't come in here. It'll be cast into outer darkness.
But you're never going to stop it completely.
I don't suggest that for a moment. What I suggest is, if you're going to do anything remotely effective, you should look critically at that sort of provision. And that would mean re-evaluating the UNESCO Convention.
And put forward ideas for altering the laws in other countries?
Well, if you uniformise the law, which I suppose is what the UNIDROIT Convention purports to do, for all its faults, then it wouldn't make any difference where you took it and sold it, because the same long arm would apply wherever it was. And if you uniformise the laws on not letting things in, then again it wouldn't matter where you took it, because you couldn't take it anywhere.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
I nearly came back.
I nearly came back on somewhere. Sorry, the previous evidence session stimulated an interesting conversation between Mr. Maxton and myself. And that being so, I'm afraid that we've kept you waiting for a moment.
That is illicit.
Watch it. What I said to you was in confidence.
Oh, right.
Mr. Fern.
Do you know what the word is?
Good morning. You argue that the conduct of the antiquities trade damages the reputation of the much larger and better regulated fine art market. In what ways does the latter better regulate than the former?
Well, I think in the fine art market, I think it's more accepted practice that you have a provenance, you have an ownership history, accompanying objects for sale, which isn't...
Could you speak up just a little?
Sorry, yes, in the fine art market, I think it's accepted practice that any object up for sale would be accompanied by a comprehensive ownership history, or an ownership history of sorts at least. And this isn't the practice. This is the general practice with antiquities. And so what is seen to happen is that we'll point the finger at the antiquities traders and say, well, this is all a bit murky here, we don't know what's going on, there's looted material entering onto the market and it's all a bit dodgy. And then by association, it might be that the art trade generally in London becomes tarred by the same brush.
But in the fine art market, I mean, we see brochures where there's no indication whatsoever which owner was there before, who owned it, where it came from, really, although most people know where it came from. Are they not just as bad as the other trade?
Well, I think if you investigate a piece of art, I think generally you can trace back an ownership history, I think, and you know who painted the object in the first place. You hope that you know the painter. So I think it's a lot more open than the antiquities trade. I think this is the crucial point. It's more open to investigation.
So are we falling down on the export laws? Are they the things at fault, really and truly?
I think that the problem with the export laws is that they offer a mechanism, if you like, to trace part of an ownership history of an antiquity. So I'm not talking about export control. I'm not talking about stopping objects leaving the country. I'm just saying that when objects leave the country, we should make a check on its previous documentation to make sure it was exported illegally from the country from whence it originated. And the only way we can do that really is if we say that every object over a certain price threshold needs an export license. And to obtain an export license, you need to produce documentary evidence of its legal export from country of origin. I think that would do two things. One, it would give us some quantifiable information about the scale of the trade and the shape of the trade, and it would also go some way, I think, to stamping out the movement of illicit material through this country.
So what figure would you put on it? I mean, are we talking about anything over £2,000 or what, 3,000?
As a price threshold?
Yeah.
I'd put a very low threshold. I'd be talking about £1,000, I think, perhaps even lower.
1,000.
Sorry, our colleagues are not able to hear you, Dr.
Sorry.
Brady. I'm sorry, the acoustics in this room are pretty terrible.
Yeah. Are these microphones working?
The microphone is not an amplification. It's for
okay, right,
broadcasting.
I shall lean forward an extra inch.
Sorry, don't want to be discourteous to you.
Yeah, I'd look towards a threshold. I would look towards a low threshold, actually, of about £1,000, perhaps even lower. I think the large majority of antiquities that go out of this country. Can you still not hear? Oh, sorry. You're probably looking at under £500. So I think if you set a threshold of £500 or £1,000, you're going to catch a lot of antiquities, but you're not going to be dealing with all like the little odd Roman coins or musket balls or belt buckles or all this type of stuff that's going out. So I would have a threshold in the £500 to £1,000 area.
Have you ever followed any object through to find out what happens to it yourself?
Myself, I haven't. No, I mean, you can't do it really. I mean, if I go to an auction house or a dealer and say, where did you sell, you know, who did you sell that object to? He'll just say, well, I'm not telling you. So, so the inquiry stops there early.
Would you still purchase something if someone said that to you? I don't know where it came from, or I'm not telling you where it came from.
Well, I think it'd be very foolish to purchase something under those circumstances. I think, you know, in any market.
But people do, don't they?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Organ.
I'm astonished, and I'm sorry I interrupted when you were answering Mr. Fern. The threshold that you suggested is very low. I mean, we are talking about the necessary requirement to do that. I mean, we're almost talking about going into your average high street junk shop at that sort of level and turning over what's on every shelf. I mean, is it actually deliverable and feasible if you do set the threshold so low?
Well, we're only talking about objects which are exported. We're not talking about objects which are sold within the United Kingdom. And I think if you don't have a low threshold, it becomes a pointless exercise. I mean, if we're only going to license objects over a high price threshold, we'll only be licensing a very few objects, and it's a bit of a waste of time, really, then. I mean, the point is, we want to have an idea of what's moving out the country, and the only way we can get an idea of what's moving out the country is by logging it effectively, and we don't achieve that if we exclude, you know, a large part of it in the first place. So I think to be effective, it has to have a reasonably low threshold.
And do you think it actually is deliverable to do this, that we are going to be able to have the resources to chase up thresholds that low?
You see, I don't understand. I mean, I've been told that it is illegal to charge for an export license, and I don't understand this. I don't see why there can't be a handling fee involved, even a very low handling fee. That if an export license was required, you could charge £1 maybe, or maybe a percentage of the price of the object. And if the volume of objects flowing out the country is as high as we're led to believe, that would generate a large sum of money which could be used to administer the system. And I personally don't see that there's a problem there, and I'd like to hear what the legal objection is, I think, really.
What so far is the objection? Is it a legal objection?
Well, I've just been told at second hand that we can't charge for an export licence. It is illegal, but I don't know on what basis that is. I mean, I'd like to hear, you know, an authoritative version of that.
Thank you.
Mr. Max.
Yeah, I'm still a bit confused between antiquities. I mean, did you hear my earlier question to Professor Renfrew about the freeing up of the trade to some extent? Is that not a more legitimate way of doing it, or rather a better way of doing it? And there are so much antiquities. What archaeologists want, as has been said, is the knowledge, is the information. But, I mean, that site there, next to that site there, is not necessarily going to give you any different information, except on a very narrow points. Wouldn't it be better to just say, well, all we need are some sites, we don't need all of them?
I mean, there are several aspects to this question. In the present market, the present market situation, I think it'd be very dangerous to free up controls completely. If we look at the United States is the one country in the world with no export control, and it suffers very badly from archaeological looting. So, you know, obviously a liberal export regime doesn't protect the archaeological heritage. There's also this point that there's a lot of material lying around in Mediterranean countries that maybe they could export, and maybe that would go, you know, that would help the market. And I'm always a bit mystified by this. I've worked in 3 museums in Greece, 3 regional museums or provincial museums, and I've never seen a lot of material lying around in the storerooms. It's on display. If there are objects that people would be willing to buy on the market here, they're normally on display in the museums. What you see in the storerooms are boxes full of fragments and broken pots, which by and large I don't think people would want to buy here. So I'm not too convinced by this argument. There's a lot of material waiting to be exported. But I do agree with Professor Renfrew. I think in an ideal world, if the market here was fully open, fully transparent, so that everybody could see what was going on and everybody trusted everyone else, and the Italians or even the Malians or anyone they could look at Britain, they could look at the international market and say, yes, it's all above board, no problems here. And I think then you could see a position where these governments would be more liberal and they would be prepared to release a portion at least of their archaeological material onto the market.
That's what I'm saying. I don't think anybody would suggest that it should be a totally unregulated market, but it would be better if it was a regulated market, but a market, and not just regulated, which tends to be at the present time. So that if someone finds something, they would have to take it, yes, to the local museum or to some organisation who would then say, where did you find it? Can you tell us about it? Exactly where you got it? Right, we've got 1,000 of those already, you can put that on the market. Would that not make more sense?
Well, what you obviously want a system, I mean, it's all about a balance, really, achieving the correct balance, because you want a system which encourages people to report any chance finds, but you don't want a system that encourages them to go out and look for them, really. And I think the problem at the moment, because prices are so high, people are encouraged to go out and look for material, actively look for material for sale. And obviously, if you completely deregulate it in that market environment, it would be a disaster. So we really need to have a market environment where antiquities aren't seen to be desirable commodities or collectibles or investment objects. And then if we deregulate them, you know, I think it would work.
I am quite interested, as somebody who loved watching Lovejoy, this argument that the fine arts market is somehow more respectable than the... but up to a point, where do you draw the line between what's an antiquity, what's an antique? I noticed one of our previous witnesses collected antique cars. When does an antique car become an antique car? Every car I've owned has just dropped down in value completely, whereas I suppose if I'd hung on to some of them long enough, they'd have started to go back up again. So where do we draw lines?
I think that's a deceptively simple question. I'm afraid the answer can't be as simple as maybe everybody would like. And I also suspect that different people would give you different answers. I suspect the trade generally would have a more precise answer than I would. I think the trade might say, well, you know, it's quite obvious an antiquity is something that comes from the lands of classical antiquity, maybe. You know, maybe it's something that dates before 1000 AD from the general area of the Mediterranean or the Near East. That might be their description. I don't know. Maybe they'd have a different one. But for archaeologists, it's very hard, really, to put a hard and fast definition on what is an antiquity. I mean, antiquity is a convenient shorthand, really, and it varies from place to place. We could say, well, it's an object that's come out of the ground, but then obviously that would exclude any archaeological monuments. So obviously, you know, that's not a very satisfactory definition. We could put a time threshold on. We could say anything from anything before 1000 AD is an antiquity, but then we would have to exclude a large part of the pre-Columbian archaeological heritage, for instance. We'd have to exclude the Incas, the Aztecs. So obviously that's a very poor definition. So I think we can't actually say in strict terms, you know, an antiquity is something that was found in a particular context before a particular time. I don't think that works. I think what we do think that, and I mean, if we go back to the steel mills and the coal mines, what we have there, we have a situation where we can go to the library, we can read about the steel industry, we can read about the coal industry. There's probably endless books being written about it. It's all well documented. There are archives. So the actual steel mills themselves and the coal mines aren't our only source of information about society at that time or about the industry. So what we do, we preserve a representative example, really, so we can go to all the other sources and then go to the one preserved steel mill. But this isn't the case with archaeological or countries only known through their archaeology. There is no documentary evidence at all. We're reliant upon the archaeology to reconstruct the history. And I think it's these circumstances, when they prevail, that we are then looking at antiquities that we would call material antiquities. It's because the objects really provide us with the only information that there is of a society or of a certain aspect of society. I mean, I think that would be my definition at the end of the day.
What do you do about a situation which must crop up again and again, where somebody takes along an object to a sale house and doesn't know much about it except being able to say it's been in the family for years?
That's fine. I mean, if they know that, I mean, that's a provenance of sorts. If it's been in the family for years, they can tell us how long it's been in the family. There's a general feeling, I think, now emerging, or a general agreement that you've got to have a cut-off somewhere. I mean, when we're talking about these issues, you've got to have a cut-off. I mean, we can't just go back for hundreds of years and try and put everything back in its original place. And there's a consensus emerging that a reasonable cut-off date would be 1970. So that anything that was outside its country of origin before 1970, well, okay, you know, it's too far gone now. But anything that moved out of its country of origin illegally after 1970 well, that would be considered illicit. Now, if somebody comes into a showroom and says, well, this has been in my family, since 1938, well, that's fine. It's been out of the country, before 1970. So that would be, we would consider that to be illicit.
And how widely would you cast your net? Yesterday, I, by chance, went into a shop in Chelsea where they had a film poster from 1956, which I'm greatly tempted to buy, I might say. Would you include that in the kind of objects you're talking about?
Well, I wouldn't, 'cause I mean, this gets back to my point that wouldn't be a primary source of information about society in the 1950s.
And very easily ascertainable in that case too.
Sorry?
Very easily ascertainable in that case.
Yeah, yeah.
No doubt whatever about what it is. And since it's a very rare film, nobody would ever have bothered to reprint it. Mr. Keane.
Yes, I mean, although we're at the early stage of this inquiry, I think we can be of great help to all of the industry. It seems to be even. But I mean, it's very clear it's already done an awful lot for, I think, second-hand car dealers, politicians and journalists, because we've already moved off the bottom of the league. As I asked Lord Renfrew, to paint a picture of the collectors, could you paint a picture of the dealers? They can't all be as bad as we seem to be hearing, surely.
Well, I wouldn't really like to comment on the dealing community because I don't have any dealings with them, really. I'm not a collector. I don't buy antiquities.
About what they do then. I mean, there must be some who would be happy about their operations, because that's what you're an expert in.
I think that's a personal thing. I mean, if you know people, you know generally how they operate. You must know how open they are with you and how reliable they are, I assume. And there are going to be other dealers who are particularly, well, I hesitate to use the term shady, but will withhold information. But I think that's very much, it's a personal thing. It'd be part of the relationship between a purchaser and a dealer, really. And I don't think I'm in a position, really, to start commenting on who would be a reliable dealer or an unreliable dealer.
Why do you think the British government has refused so far to sign Unidroit and the UNESCO agreement?
I would imagine that I would imagine they're afraid that it would damage the British economy. But I don't know. I don't think they've ever said that, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, it might damage the art trade, perhaps.
But I mean, as a proportion of the total economy, and surely it can't be that. Is it more likely to be the administration required, or is there are there special interests in the people who are represented in DCMS, or not within the department itself, of course, but those closely associated with it, the people that they mix with?
So it's very difficult for us to answer this because when the government announced in February, for instance, that it wouldn't ratify the UNESCO Convention, it gave no reasons at that time. So we're left kind of guessing the reasons. We can look at reasons which have been given in the past. And there is this problem that, you have to produce a list of objects for the UNESCO Convention, and obviously that's very tiresome, we're not able to do it. Well, that objection now has been shown to be a false one. In actual fact, you can just have a set of categories which already exist in Britain for purposes of export licensing. So that's one argument which really we can dispose of. There is this argument that the art trade might be damaged, but we have to look at, we look at the United States here. They ratified UNESCO in 1983, and over the past decade, their art marketing has outperformed the British one, so obviously it hasn't had an adverse effect there. And then there are these legal points which I find more difficult to comment on because I'm not a lawyer really, and I think Professor Palmer's probably dealt with those better than I can.
But have you thought whether the net itself will begin to open up the situation altogether? Because I mean, even the private collectors, like to show off what they've got now and again to the public. Has there been any attempt to put these collections on the net so people can get in and see them?
The internet?
Yeah, the internet.
Yeah. I think I haven't actually. I know of one major collection now, I think, which is going on the internet, but I don't particularly go looking for them. But I do know of one, I think. The more worrying thing about the internet is the appearance of internet auctions, really, and internet sales, because they're going to be very, very hard to regulate. We were talking before about, is Britain being badly looted at the moment? I'm currently monitoring internet sales for particular category of British objects, and after a year or so maybe I'll have a bit of an answer about what's moving out of the country. But it is quite depressing because you can see adverts for, you know, Roman coins fresh out of the ground in Britain, current location United States, up for sale on the internet, you know, whatever the price is. Well, I'm sure they haven't gone through any kind of, you know, documenting system here. And I think that's quite worrying. So I think I'm more worried about the internet as really helping the market become more deregulated, in fact.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mills.
Following on the first question, Mr. King-Cook, would there be a case perhaps for licensing dealers so that, you know, you could only deal in antiquities if you had a license to do so, and if you were then, of course, caught dealing in something which was stolen, then you would be under threat of losing that license, and if you lost your license, you then could no longer be a dealer.
Well, I'd find myself in favour of that idea, but I doubt if the dealers themselves would be very favourable towards it. So,
It's a thought.
But presumably you could do what you said with regard to specific objects, namely have a minimum turnover, so that a little antique shop on Stockport Road in Levenshulme, in my constituency, where we've got a great, wherever that might be, it's at the centre of the universe. In Levenshulme in Manchester, along Stockport Road, there's a whole chain of antique shops, as there are in some of the smaller towns as you go out towards Buxton. And some of those may do a great deal of trade, some may do little, but presumably they all have to do VAT returns. And on the basis of that, you could have a minimum turnover, couldn't you?
yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, you've got to look there as well at the... I mean, we'd have to... I mean, it'd be interesting, actually, to analyse the structure of the market, because obviously there's a trickle-down effect here, but there must be kind of like nodal points in the market which would have a higher turnover. If you could focus on these points, it would then mean that as stuff came through it, you know, we would have some sort of control. So I think that...
One follow-up on your conversation with Mr. Keane. When we were in Rome, we went along to Unidroit, and Ms. Schneider gave us an account of this. When I asked her what actual good Unidroit had done in stopping illegal trade, I think it's fair to summarise her answer as none. That being so, what's the point of signing up to a convention whose achievements by the person responsible for it are not proclaimed as being substantial, to put it mildly?
I think Ms. Schneider was possibly being unduly gloomy. Other commentators...
Well, I don't think she was gloomy. Yeah. I think she was talking herself up, actually.
Yeah. Well, other commentators who've been very closely associated with Unidroit have said, in actual fact, its major effect probably has been in the area of due diligence and encouraging this concept of due diligence, and it's been very influential there, and you'll see this moving through now into other areas, and you've got the recent COPAT codes which have just been released. And I think people would argue that even if nobody signs Unidroit, it has been influential, at least, in improving standards, really, in the market. So I think it's wrong to say it had no effect whatsoever. I think also it's meant to be, in a way, it's like a bolt-on piece to the UNESCO Convention. So as a standalone piece of legislation, it's probably not as effective. As Professor Palmer said, there is no mechanism in Unidroit to allow import controls to be placed. There are in UNESCO. So you really need to ratify UNESCO as well as Unidroit for it to have its maximum effect.
Dr. Brodie, thank you very much indeed.
Okay,
it's been a very useful session indeed.
Nice, thanks.